Thank you for downloading from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Support for this podcast comes from your generous gifts and donations. You can find out more about Ravi Zacharias and the team at www.rzim.org.
It was only recently, just a few days ago, where an early morning call into our home came with a broken heart that the marriage is everything she knew it would be when marrying outside the will of God. But in that particular culture, the parent forced and insisted, and the girl now sees years of hell ahead of her.
We live in a world where people have lost faith in marriage. Optimism has been replaced with skepticism. What does it take to make a relationship stand the test of time? Join us for the answers as we look at the story of Isaac and Rebekah. Today on Just Thinking with author and apologist Ravi Zacharias. Welcome back to Just Thinking. Everywhere we turn in our society, we are bombarded by sensuality. In the midst of this overwhelming saturation, how can we guard against falling into temptation? Ravi Zacharias' message this week comes from the story of Isaac and Rebekah and the godly principles we can learn from them. Today he offers good wisdom on how to deal with those pressures and how we can stay true in an impure world. Here's Ravi.
Let me give to you a powerful principle. And please forgive me, young people, for being so blunt, but I have covered many, many college campuses in North America. I have done many of them, and I want to say this kindly and honestly before God. Some of our so-called Christian college campuses, some of them, not all of them, obviously, but some of them have sent out young people out of there who are so messed up when they leave. They have messed themselves up in the 3 to 4 years while they are there. They went to a Bible college thinking it'll keep them from temptation. They go to a Bible college to find out just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're above temptation. I spoke in one college for 5 nights. I took my wife Margie with me. I was speaking morning and evening. God's my witness in this. I was counseling nonstop through the whole day. I took her with me because I thought we'd have time. In 5 days, I just had one dinner with her. From morning till night, every young fellow or girl who came, with the exception of one young lad who was seeking the mind of God for missionary work, in 5 days, sandwiched from morning till night, even my lunch was being eaten while I was talking with kids. Every one of them, except for one, was morally ruined. So hear me carefully. Inside you may mock, but on the outside you'll find out what I'm saying to you is true. There are principles that are very precise here. Malcolm Muggeridge was in India. He was a callous man in terms of his morals. His pen knew no limits. Nothing was sacred for him. And while he was a professor in southern India, Malcolm Muggeridge, by the way, went into India as a religious man, came out of India as an atheist. He went into Russia as an atheist, came out of Russia as a religious man. He goes to India and he's a professor in a southern university. And he had been taught, he'd been raised to indulge the way he wanted to. He says this in his biography. And he says one day he was by the banks of a river, and only Muggeridge can describe this. Please pardon the crass illustration, but it's as powerful as you'll ever hear. He says, way out in the distance at sunrise, I saw the woman in the distance bathing. And finally I said, well, maybe this is my moment. I've waited long enough. And in the panting of his heart, he gives to me the character of sin. He writes how his heart beat harder and harder and harder because this was his moment of consummation in illegitimacy. He'd fought it for so long. And he swims and swims and swims, and his mind is feeding him with all the enticement of iniquity, not telling him of all the horrors of it. He's swimming as hard as he can, and he paints this appetite that is only getting more and more powerful by the moment. He'd kept his control of will for so long, till he comes closer and closer, emerges from the water within 2 feet away of this woman that he'd seen so much in the distance. And he says, in that one solitary moment, I just about gagged, and he says, as I just about threw up with an utter sense of sickness within me, for I was looking at a woman who was a leper. the worn away features, the socketed eyes, the broken fingers. And as he looked at it, Muggeridge says this, I am assuming that as vulgar a man as I was, there was only one powerful way for God to deal with me, to show me what a leprous heart I had. You get into an illicit relationship. Hear me? You get into an illicit relationship, and very soon you will be justifying many other illegitimacies. And it'll turn desire into disrespect, if not hatred. May I challenge you to abide by a principle, and only you can seek the mind of God in this. But I'll tell you what would be my desire for my children. I cannot control it. By God's grace, I can try and discipline their minds into believing that this is true. Be careful of those moments you spend alone. There was one principle Margie and I had, which was this: we would never ever be alone without being accessible to somebody in either a public or a home setting. So that if we were in her home visiting, we'd be talking in the living room, or in my home, whatever, where their parents had access to us, or whether we were in a dining room or a hockey game or whatever it was a principle we abided by before God. We did our best to keep in those public areas so that God could enable us to honor the commitments we'd made to Him and were making to each other. Follow what I'm saying? The Apostle Paul says to make not provision for the flesh. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make not provision for the flesh. May I translate it into saying, do not put yourself in a place where you can fall. All right? Number one, someone else was involved in the choice. Number two, the person involved, kindness was one principle. Number three, there was purity of heart. Number four, there was a readiness and a willingness. Parents, please hear me now. Just as I believe it is wrong for the parent it is wrong for the child to violate the parent's desire in this, I also believe it is important that the parent respects the child's integrity in this and not violate their choice by insisting upon that which the child does not desire. In other words, if the parent, as happens in many parts in my culture, as a matter of fact, right now, if I had the liberty to tell you, a very key person converted in one of our meetings in one of the major countries of this world, a personal secretary to the royal family in that country, right now, has been forcibly violated in her will to marry somebody, although she has committed her life to Christ and the boy has not. And it was only recently, just a few days ago, where an early morning call into our home came with a broken heart that the marriage is everything she knew it would be when marrying outside the will of God. But in that particular culture, the parent forced and insisted, and the girl now sees years of hell ahead of her. She was ready and willing. The relatives looked at Rebekah and said, look, you don't have to go right now. You want to wait? She said, no, I'm ready and willing, and I want to go. One of my favorite stories is this. I've got some very dear friends in the audience tonight who've been to India with us. They will remember some of these instances. When you get married in India, it's a big thing. The bridegroom in the Hindu culture comes on a horse. For that reason alone, I'm glad I'm not a Hindu. I don't think I'd ever want to get onto a horse. You come riding on a horse, wearing a red and gold jacket, and you get a bunch of fellows around you who are supposed to be the band. Halfway through, you wish desperately they'd practice. But they're playing as they're going along, and the women carrying the lamps at night, and the bridegroom comes riding into the home of the bride, and he dismounts his horse. He's carrying a sword on the right. It's the symbol of the fact that he's won the right to love this woman, the woman in her beautifully arrayed sari and so on and so forth. And that's the picture that comes into mind as I give you this illustration that really comes out of England. Supposedly a true story. It's a fellow called George in love with a girl called Mary. Mary and George were engaged to be married till George was drafted into the army, and he says, Mary, you wait for me. No point getting married and going to the battlefield. After the war is over, I'll come back and we'll get married. Mary agreed. Many days went by, letters would come, and then finally the letters stopped coming. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, many weeks went by, no letters. Finally a commanding officer comes and says that George is missing, believed to be dead. This completely breaks Mary's heart. She doesn't know what to do. Many days go by, many months go by. She's not able to get this out of her mind. One evening she comes back from work and says, "Mother, I'm really under the weather. Can I go to my room? Please don't disturb me." And she goes into her room and she shuts the door. And she gets there and she takes all of George's letters and she's reading them, and the tears are running down her face as she thinks of him. Then she decides to bring George's picture, looks at his picture, reads the letters, and the tears are running down the face. Then finally she says, "I'm going to make this more real." And for the first time she took out the wedding dress that had long been bought before George had left, puts on the wedding dress, looks into the mirror, looks at the picture, reads the letters, sobbing her heart out. So involved in this ritual, she doesn't hear a knock on the door downstairs. And the mother goes and opens the door and just about falls off. She says, "George, what are you doing here?" He says, "Mother, is Mary home?" "Yeah, but Georgie, you're supposed to be dead." He says, "Well, no, I'm all right. Is Mary married?" She says, "No, but George, what's the matter?" He says, "Mother, could you please step aside for a moment so I can go and see Mary first?" And she says she's upstairs in her room, and George trots up the stairway and he looks through the keyhole first. And in England, some of those keyholes are so big you can almost walk through them. And he sees Mary in her bridal dress there, and he gently opens the door. Her back is to him, and he gently tiptoes towards her, taps her on the shoulder. She turns around in a state of shock and says, "Georgie," wraps her arms around him, and I can't continue the story, except to tell you that he loosens one arm, dips into a hip pocket, opens a dog-eared piece of paper, and it says, "Mary dear, of all the letters you wrote to me, this one is the most precious to me." It says this, "Georgie dear, I love you. I love you. I love you. And when you come back, I'll be ready." He said, "Honey, I didn't know you'd be so ready."
If marriage is as grand as the Bible intended it to be, then it's worth waiting until you're ready for that right moment. A great illustration from Ravi Zacharias. We'll join Ravi tomorrow for the conclusion of his message, "I, Isaac, Take You, Rebekah." If you'd like to order your own copy of this program on CD or Ravi's book by the same title, please call us at 1-800-448-6766. That number again is 1-800-448-6766. Or you can order online at rzim.org. And while you're there, you can browse our entire catalog of resources from Ravi Zacharias and other members of the RZIM team. You can also use our site to find out about any upcoming events our ministry may be holding in your area. Or you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. We update our site regularly with new materials and information, so we encourage you to check back often. That's rzim.org. Just Thinking is a listener-supported radio ministry and is furnished by Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. To send any questions, comments, or donations by mail, write to RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia, 30010. I'm Bob Dittmer. Be sure to tune in again tomorrow as we hear the conclusion of Ravi Zacharias' message, "I, Isaac, Take You, Rebekah." Until then, keep thinking.